Over the last 10,000 years, humans have bent nearly every useful bird on the planet to their will. The chicken, descended from a shy forest bird that scratched through the undergrowth of Southeast Asian jungles, now outnumbers every other bird species on Earth. There are roughly 25 billion of them alive at any given moment, more than 3 for every human being on the planet. The pigeon was recruited from sea cliffs and trained to carry coded messages across entire continents. We bred ducks for their eggs, geese for their down and their willingness to attack intruders, turkeys for holiday centerpieces, and canaries to suffocate in coal mines so that miners would know when the air was turning poisonous. We even domesticated the ostrich, a 2.5-meter tall dinosaur descendant that weighs as much as an adult male gorilla and can disembowel a lion with a single kick. We farm that animal. We collect its eggs, which weigh about as much as 24 chicken eggs, and we sell its leather as a luxury good. But there is one bird that has lived alongside humans for tens of thousands of years, followed our civilizations across every continent, watched our cities rise from mud brick outposts to glass and steel skylines, fed from our refuse, nested on our rooftops and raised its young within earshot of ours. A bird more intelligent than any species humans have ever managed to domesticate. A bird that recognizes individual human faces, manufactures and uses tools, solves multi-step logical puzzles, and teaches its children which specific people are dangerous. The crow. So how did the smartest bird on the planet become the one we never tamed? The answer is not what you expect. It is not that crows were useless to humans, or that nobody tried, or that some accident of geography kept the two species apart. The answer runs deeper than that, into the very mechanics of what domestication does to an animal's brain, and what it would cost a crow to surrender. The trait that makes crows so remarkable to researchers today, their extraordinary cognitive ability, is the same trait that made domestication biologically impossible. But that was just a barrier. The real reason goes further. To see it, you first have to understand what domestication actually is. And it is far stranger than you think. In 1959, a Soviet geneticist named Dmitry Belyaev began an experiment at the Institute of Cytology and Genetics in Novosibirsk, Siberia, that would reshape how biologists understand the entire domestication process. Belyaev took a population of wild silver foxes from a commercial fur farm, animals that would bite, claw, and panic at the approach of any human handler, and began selectively breeding them for one trait only: tameness. He was not training them, he was not conditioning them with food rewards or repetition. He was choosing which foxes could reproduce based solely on their behavioral reaction to human contact. The calmest 10% of each generation, roughly 1 in every 10 foxes, were selected for breeding. The rest were excluded from the gene pool entirely. The results came faster than anyone predicted. Within 6 generations, some foxes were wagging their tails at researchers. By generation 10, they were licking human hands. By generation 15, they were whimpering for attention, rolling onto their backs for belly rubs, and seeking out human contact with the eagerness of a golden retriever puppy. But Belyaev noticed something he had not anticipated: that tame foxes were changing physically. Their ears began to droop, their tails curled upward. Their coats developed patches of white and brown that wild silver foxes never display. Their skulls shortened, their snouts became more compact. Their adrenal glands, the organs responsible for the fight-or-flight stress response, shrank measurably, and their brains got smaller. That last detail is the one that determines the entire trajectory of this story. Domesticated animals, across virtually every species humans have tamed, carry smaller brains relative to body size than their wild ancestors. Domesticated sheep have brains roughly 24% smaller than wild mouflon, the mountain sheep they descend from. That is nearly a quarter of their brain volume gone. Domestic pigs have lost approximately 33% of their brain mass compared to wild boar, a full third of the cognitive hardware their ancestors relied on to survive. Even dogs, the most celebrated domestication success story in the history of our species, carry brains about 20% smaller than the wolves they were bred from. Roughly a fifth of the processing power that once made their ancestors the apex social predators of the Northern Hemisphere, quietly dissolved across thousands of generations of selective breeding. The pattern is so universal that biologists have given it a formal name: domestication syndrome. And it reveals something uncomfortable about every domesticated animal you have ever interacted with. When humans select for tameness, they are selecting against the neural architecture that makes an animal vigilant, reactive, suspicious, and cognitively independent. The brain regions governing threat detection, novel problem solving, and behavioral flexibility are the same regions that shrink when an animal no longer needs to fight, flee, or think its way out of danger. A domestic chicken does not need to outsmart a leopard stalking through dark undergrowth. A farm duck does not need to navigate 3,000 miles of open ocean by reading magnetic fields and star patterns. The selection pressures that built those abilities have been removed, and the brain tissue that supported them has quietly disappeared over the generations. Domestication, at its biological core, is a trade. The animal surrenders cognitive complexity and behavioral independence. In return, it receives guaranteed food, shelter, and protection from predators. For species whose survival never depended heavily on intelligence, the trade is nearly painless. A chicken's wild ancestor, the red jungle fowl, was never an intellectual titan in the forests of Southeast Asia. Losing some brain volume cost it very little in functional terms. But for a crow, that trade would be catastrophic. And to see exactly why, it helps to understand which birds we did domesticate and what made them vulnerable to the process in the first place. The chicken is the most important domesticated bird in human history, and for decades, scientists believed its domestication stretched back 8 to 10,000 years. That timeline was wrong. In 2022, a sweeping genetic and archaeological study led by Gregor Larsen at the University of Oxford and Joris Peters at Ludwig Maximilian University of Munich, published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, concluded that chicken domestication likely began around 1500 BCE in the river valleys of Southeast Asia. Far more recently than anyone had estimated. The trigger, Larsen's team argued, was the spread of rice farming. As rice paddies expanded across what is now Thailand, Myanmar, and southern China, they created an ecological niche that had never existed before in the natural world. Flooded fields swarming with insects, grain scattered along muddy field edges, warm, wet soil teeming with worms and larvae. The red jungle fowl, a ground-dwelling bird that naturally scratched through forest leaf litter for seeds and small invertebrates, walked right into this artificial paradise and never left. The jungle fowl's temperament made it an easy target. Red jungle fowl live in small social groups with a clear pecking order. One dominant male controls a harem of several females. The birds are cautious but not especially flighty. They do not panic and scatter at the first sign of movement the way grouse or pheasants do. When early rice farmers began leaving grain near their settlements, the jungle fowl that were least afraid of human presence ate more, survived longer, and produced more offspring. Over a few hundred generations, the tamest birds were living permanently alongside human villages, strutting through the gaps between bamboo houses and sleeping under thatched eaves. Within 1,000 years, they were being traded along maritime routes from Southeast Asia to Egypt and across the Mediterranean, arriving in Europe by roughly 800 BCE. The pigeon followed a remarkably similar trajectory. Rock doves, the wild ancestor of every domestic pigeon on Earth, nested naturally on cliff faces and fed on seeds in open terrain. When humans started building stone and brick structures with flat ledges and conveniently nearby grain stores, rock doves found a cliff substitute that happened to come with an unlimited food supply. Sumerian clay tablets from roughly 3000 BCE describe organized pigeon-keeping operations in the temple complexes of Mesopotamia. By the time of ancient Rome, pigeons were being bred for meat, for religious sacrifice, and for their astonishing homing ability, a navigational skill that allowed a single bird to carry a message across 800 kilometers of unfamiliar terrain, roughly the distance from Paris to Moscow, and arrive at precisely the right rooftop. That ability made them indispensable to military commanders for over 3,000 years, from Persian kings to British intelligence officers in the trenches of the Western Front. Ducks were domesticated independently in at least 2 locations across Asia. The mallard was tamed in China around 500 BCE, and a separate domestication event occurred in Southeast Asia from the same wild species. Geese were domesticated in Egypt from the gray-lag goose at least 3,000 years ago, valued for their eggs, their fat, their feathers, and their aggressive territorial behavior, which made them surprisingly effective guard animals. The Roman writer Pliny the Elder credited geese with saving Rome itself, claiming that their frantic honking alerted defenders to a Gallic night attack on the Capitol Hill in 390 BCE. Turkeys were domesticated by indigenous peoples in Mesoamerica around 800 BCE, initially not for meat but for their feathers, which were woven into ceremonial garments and ritual blankets. Guinea fowl were domesticated in West Africa. Quail were semi-domesticated in Japan for their small, richly flavored eggs. Even the peafowl, an animal whose primary contribution to human civilization has been standing in ornamental gardens and screaming at 4 in the morning, has been kept and selectively bred for over 4,000 years across the Indian subcontinent and beyond. In 1997, Jared Diamond at the University of California, Los Angeles identified 6 criteria that determine whether a wild animal can be successfully domesticated. The animal must have a flexible diet. It must grow to useful size within a reasonable time frame. It must breed willingly in captivity. It must have a tractable disposition. It must not have an uncontrollable panic response to confinement or human proximity. And it must possess a social hierarchy that allows a human to slot into the dominant role. Chickens satisfy every single criterion. So do ducks, geese, turkeys, pigeons, and guinea fowl. So, remarkably, do ostriches, despite the fact that an adult ostrich stands taller than most professional basketball players and can sprint at 70 kilometers per hour, roughly the speed of a car on a suburban road. Crows on paper should qualify too. They are omnivorous, eating everything from insects to grain to discarded fast food. They mature in about 2 years. They live in social groups with recognizable hierarchies. They are not physically threatening to humans. And they have been living in and around human settlements for at least as long as chickens have, possibly far longer. So why did the process never take hold? This is where the story takes a turn that nobody in the field anticipated until the evidence became impossible to ignore. The answer arrived in a landmark paper published in 2004 that forced the entire discipline of animal cognition to reassess what bird brains were capable of. Nathan Emery at Queen Mary University of London and Nicola Clayton at the University of Cambridge published their findings in the journal Science under a title that read like a deliberate provocation: The Mentality of Crows. Their argument, supported by dozens of behavioral studies spanning multiple corvid species and multiple continents, was that corvids, the taxonomic family encompassing crows, ravens, magpies, and jays, possess cognitive abilities that rival, and in some cases exceed those of the great apes. Emery and Clayton called corvids feathered apes. The label was not a poetic flourish. It was a conclusion drawn from controlled experimental data comparing corvid performance to chimpanzee and orangutan performance on identical cognitive tasks. Consider the evidence that existed even at the time of that paper, and what has accumulated in the 2 decades since. New Caledonian crows, a species native to a small cluster of islands in the South Pacific, manufacture tools in the wild. Not picking up sticks and using them as probes, which several bird species do, and which would be interesting but not groundbreaking. Manufacturing. They select specific raw materials from their environment, modify them with their beaks, and shape them into functional implements with distinct designs. In the mossy forests of New Caledonia, individual crows cut strips from the barbed edges of pandanus leaves, trimming and tapering them into hook-shaped tools that can be inserted into tree bark crevices to extract beetle larvae. Different populations of New Caledonian crows produce tools with different design features, and young crows learn the local tool-making tradition by watching their parents work. The knowledge is cultural. It passes between generations. It evolves and improves over time. In 2002, a New Caledonian crow named Betty, working in a laboratory at the University of Oxford under researchers Alex Koselnik and Jackie Chappell, was presented with a narrow vertical tube containing a small bucket of food. A straight piece of wire lay nearby. Betty picked up the wire, examined the tube, and then bent the wire into a hook, using her beak and one foot braced against the lab bench. She lowered the hook into the tube, caught the bucket handle, and pulled the food out. She had never seen wire before that day. She had no training on the task. She had never observed another crow bending wire. She assessed a novel problem, identified that the available tool was inadequate in its current form, and modified the raw material into a new shape to solve a problem she had never encountered. That single observation, published in Science and later watched by millions of people online, forced cognitive scientists across the world to reconsider the boundaries of non-human creativity. And Betty was only the beginning. In 2014, Alex Taylor at the University of Auckland in New Zealand designed an 8-stage puzzle for a wild-caught New Caledonian crow identified only by the designation 007. The puzzle required the crow to retrieve a short stick from one compartment, use it to extract a stone from a second box, drop the stone onto a seesaw platform that released a longer stick from a third apparatus, and then use that longer stick to reach food held in a final transparent compartment. 8 interlocking steps, each dependent on the correct completion of the one before it. The crow had never encountered this puzzle before. It completed all 8 stages, in the correct sequence, on its first attempt, with no false starts and no backtracking. Taylor's team, publishing in the Proceedings of the Royal Society B, described the performance as evidence of analogical reasoning. The cognitive ability to perceive abstract relationships between objects and apply those relationships to novel and unfamiliar situations. That is the kind of reasoning that human children do not consistently demonstrate until they are 4 or 5 years old. A crow, with a brain weighing about 10 grams, roughly the mass of 2 nickels stacked together, performed it on the first try. But physical problem-solving is only one dimension of corvid intelligence. The social dimension is the one that matters for the domestication question, and it is where the story becomes genuinely troubling for anyone who ever imagined breeding a tame crow. In 2007, John Marsluff, a wildlife biologist at the University of Washington in Seattle, conducted an experiment that would become one of the most cited studies in the history of animal cognition research. Marsluff and his team captured and banded 7 American crows on the university campus. During the capture process, the researchers wore distinctive rubber caveman masks over their faces. The crows were handled briefly, weighed, measured, and released unharmed within an hour. Then the researchers waited. In the following weeks, members of Marsluff's team walked through the leaf-covered pathways of the campus, wearing the caveman masks. Every time they appeared, the previously captured crows, along with crows that had witnessed the original capture but had never been handled themselves, began scolding and dive-bombing the masked figures with violent intensity. Crows that encountered researchers wearing different masks, identical in size and shape, but with different facial features, ignored them completely, walked right past without a sound. The crows were discriminating between specific human faces, and they were furious. Marsluff continued the study for years. By 2011, when he and colleague Kaylee Swift published updated results, the scolding behavior had spread far beyond the original 7 captured birds. Crows that had never personally witnessed the capture event were now mobbing the caveman mask on site. The information about the dangerous face had been transmitted socially, from bird to bird, across the local population. Years after the original event, juvenile crows that had not even been alive during the captures were attacking a face they had never personally seen do anything threatening. Their parents, or the older crows in their social group, had taught them who to hate. Imagine trying to domesticate that. An animal that does not just remember the face of the person who captured it, but broadcasts that information to every crow within earshot, ensuring that future generations inherit a grudge they did not personally experience. Selective breeding for tameness requires handling, capturing, and confining animals over many generations. With crows, every capture event generates a lasting, spreading wave of hostility toward the captor that contaminates the entire local population. You are not working against one animal's fear. You are working against a network of collective memory that updates faster than you can intervene. Then there are the funerals. In 2015, Kaylee Swift, then a doctoral student at the University of Washington working under Marsluff, published the first rigorous experimental study of a behavior that corvid researchers had been observing in the field for decades but had never formally tested. When a crow encounters the body of a dead crow lying on the ground, it does not walk past. It does not feed on the carcass. It calls, loudly and persistently. Within minutes, dozens of crows converge from the surrounding area, arriving from rooftops and power lines and distant treetops. They gather in the branches above the body, cawing in a sustained, almost ceremonial chorus that can last 15 to 20 minutes. They do not approach the body. They do not touch it. They observe the scene from above. and then, gradually, they disperse. Swift designed experiments to determine what purpose the gathering served. She placed a taxidermied dead crow in a location where live crows regularly came to feed, and simultaneously stationed a researcher wearing a novel mask near the body. After the funeral event was over, the crows avoided that specific feeding location for days. More significantly, they began mobbing the masked figure whenever they encountered the mask in the future, even in entirely different locations far from the original site. Swift concluded that crow funerals function as social learning events. The crows assemble to determine what killed one of their own, where it happened, and who was present at the scene. They encode that information and carry it forward. A single encounter with a dead crow in a nearby human face produced a learned threat association that persisted for weeks and spread through the local population. If you are wondering how any breeding program could work on an animal that holds community-wide funerals to catalog new threats, you are asking the right question. Because nobody has ever figured it out. Humans did not ignore crows throughout history. The relationship between the two species has been intimate and complicated for thousands of years. The Norse, who built their civilization across the wind-scoured coastlines and dense birch forests of Scandinavia, revered ravens above nearly all other animals. Odin, the chief god of the Norse pantheon, was attended by two ravens named Hugin and Munin. Their names translate roughly to thought and memory. According to the Eddas, the medieval Icelandic texts that preserve the old mythology, Odin sent his ravens out each dawn to fly across the world of humans, gathering intelligence. At dusk they returned to his shoulders and whispered everything they had witnessed. The ravens were not pets. They were cognitive extensions of a god. Odin himself feared their loss. In the poem Grimnismal, he confesses that he worries about Munin's return more than Hugin's, which scholars interpret as meaning the loss of memory frightened him more than the loss of thought. The Vikings took this reverence into battle and onto the open sea. Norse seafarers carried ravens aboard their longships and released them when they believed land might be near. If the raven flew toward the horizon and did not return, land lay ahead. If it circled back to the ship, open water stretched in every direction. The raven was the first navigation instrument of the North Atlantic, centuries before the compass reached Scandinavia. At the Tower of London, ravens have been kept since at least the 1600s. A legend, possibly invented by Victorian-era romantics but treated as absolute policy by the British government, holds that if the ravens ever leave the tower, the crown and the kingdom will fall. Today, 7 ravens are maintained by a dedicated yeoman warder called the Raven Master. Each bird is fed 170 grams of raw meat per day, about the weight of a mobile phone, supplemented with blood-soaked biscuits and the occasional raw egg. Their flight feathers are trimmed regularly to prevent escape, but even with clipped wings, the ravens of the tower are not docile. Each bird has a distinct personality, documented preferences, specific humans it tolerates, and specific humans it attacks without provocation. One raven named George was formally removed from service in 1986 for destroying television antennas. Another named Grog escaped in 1981 and was last spotted outside a pub in the East End of London, which, looking back, was either incredibly brave or incredibly stupid, depending on how you feel about East End pubs in the early 1980s. And then there are the gifts. In 2015, a story from Seattle, Washington attracted global media attention. An 8-year-old girl named Gabby Mann had been feeding the neighborhood crows in her family's backyard for several years, scattering peanuts and dog kibble on a platform bird feeder each morning before school. In return, the crows began leaving her small objects on the empty feeder tray. Buttons, colored beads, pieces of polished sea glass, a tiny metal heart, a single pearl-colored earring, a rusted screw, a blue paper clip. Over time, Gabi accumulated more than 100 items that crows had deliberately carried to her feeder and placed where she would find them. Marsluff, when asked about the phenomenon, confirmed that reciprocal gift-giving has been observed in multiple crow populations across North America and Europe. The behavior is not trained, it is not conditioned through deliberate reinforcement. Crows appear to recognize individual humans who provide food and respond with objects that, while worthless in any economic sense, represent a form of social exchange that the crows are choosing to initiate. The crow is not obeying, it is reciprocating. And the moment you stop feeding it, it stops bringing you gifts. That distinction matters more than anything else in this story. A domesticated animal serves you because 10,000 years of selective breeding have wired compliance into its neurology. A crow brings you a button because it decided to, this morning, based on its own assessment of the relationship. The bond is voluntary on both sides. And the moment it stops being voluntary, the crow simply leaves. If you have been watching this far, you already know this channel does not cover surface-level content. You are the kind of person who wants to understand why the world works the way it does, not just what happened, but what it reveals about the systems underneath. Subscribe now. The algorithm will stop showing you this content if you do not tell it to keep going. And the next video covers a piece of the geological record that 3 independent research teams have examined and still cannot agree on. You do not want to miss that one. While all of this cognitive research was unfolding in university laboratories across the world, a much larger and entirely uncontrolled experiment was playing out in cities on every inhabited continent. Urban crow populations have grown explosively over the last century, and the behaviors they exhibit inside human environments have no parallel in any domesticated species. In Rochester, New York, winter crow roosts regularly reach 60,000 to 90,000 birds, roughly the population of a small city, all concentrated into a few blocks of downtown. The noise at dusk, when the flocks converge from every direction across the gray winter sky and settle into the bare branches, is audible from over a kilometer away. In Tokyo, large-billed crows have learned to crack walnuts by placing them on pedestrian crosswalks at busy intersections, waiting for cars to crush the shells under their tires, and then retrieving the exposed nut meat during the next red light when pedestrians and the crows walking among them have safe passage across the road. Researchers at Tohoku University documented this behavior across multiple intersections and confirmed that the crows were not placing nuts at random. They were specifically targeting crosswalks with traffic signals, timing their collections to the rhythm of the lights. They had learned to read human traffic infrastructure and use it as a tool. In Chatham, England, hooded crows have been filmed using bread as bait to catch fish. They place a crust of bread on the surface of a park pond, wait motionless on the bank as a fish rises toward the floating bait, and then strike with their beaks. This is planned predation using a manufactured lure. It combines tool use, patience, anticipation, and causal reasoning in a sequence that most human children could not reliably execute until the age of 6 or 7. These behaviors are not inherited in any strict genetic sense. They are invented by individual crows, observed by other crows nearby, and copied across local populations. Urban crow populations are innovating in real time, developing new solutions to new challenges faster than any domesticated species has ever adapted to anything. Every new garbage containment system, every new traffic pattern, every new outdoor dining setup with its unattended plates becomes a puzzle that local crows will eventually crack. And here is the detail that changes the math entirely. The crows are not becoming tamer. They are not drifting toward domestication through prolonged contact with human civilization, the way red jungle fowl drifted toward becoming chickens at the muddy edges of ancient rice paddies. They are becoming more sophisticated in how they exploit human systems while maintaining absolute cognitive and behavioral independence. They are evolving alongside us, but they are not evolving toward us. They are evolving in parallel, getting smarter at the same rate that human environments get more complex, and keeping their distance from the domestication trap the entire time. The biological reason this separation persists was clarified in 2014 when Adam Wilkins at Humboldt University in Berlin, along with Richard Wrangham at Harvard University and W. Tecumseh Fitch at the University of Vienna, published a paper in the journal Genetics that proposed a single developmental mechanism behind the entire domestication syndrome. Their argument centered on neural crest cells, a population of cells that form very early in embryonic development and then migrate throughout the growing body to distant locations. Neural crest cells give rise to the adrenal glands, which produce the cortisol and adrenaline that drive the fight-or-flight stress response. They also contribute to the cartilage in the ears, the enamel on the teeth, certain pigmentation cells in the skin and fur, and critically, portions of the developing forebrain. Wilkins and his colleagues propose that when humans select for tameness across generations, they are inadvertently selecting for reduced neural crest cell migration and activity. Fewer active neural crest cells means smaller adrenal glands, which means a weaker stress response, which produces a calmer, more docile animal. But reduced neural crest activity also means less cartilage development in the ears, which is why domesticated animals develop floppy ears that their wild ancestors never had. Less pigment cell migration, which explains the patchy coats and unusual color patterns. Shorter facial bones, which accounts for the rounded, puppy-like faces of domesticated breeds. And reduced brain development in the regions that depend on neural crest contributions, which explains the consistent cognitive losses measured across every domesticated species. The entire suite of domestication traits, from floppy ears in dogs to curly tails in pigs to reduced brain volume in chickens, flows from a single developmental cascade. You cannot select for docility without triggering the rest of the package. Tameness and cognitive reduction are not just correlated. They are biologically linked at the cellular level. They ride the same embryonic pathway, and there is no known way to separate them. For a chicken, this trade-off is negligible. A chicken with a brain 20% smaller than a red jungle fowl's can still eat grain, lay eggs, and reproduce in a coop. It has lost nothing it actually needs to function in a domesticated environment. For a crow, the trade-off is existential. A crow's entire survival strategy rests on intelligence. Not speed, not camouflage, not venom or armor or sheer reproductive volume. Intelligence. The ability to recognize threatening individuals by their faces and remember those faces for years. The ability to manufacture tools and teach the next generation the specific design. The ability to innovate novel solutions to problems that did not exist 6 months ago. The ability to coordinate socially across a population, share threat information through collective learning events, and adapt as a group to environments that change faster than any individual crow's lifespan. Every one of these abilities depends on the very brain architecture that domestication would systematically dismantle. A crow that underwent the domestication process, that had its neural crest cell activity dampened over generations of selection for tameness, would not become a friendlier version of itself. It would lose the cognitive abilities that define it as a species. It could not identify dangerous humans. It could not make tools. It could not teach its young. It could not adapt to new environments. It would be a smaller-brained, floppy-eared, docile bird that looked like a crow but had lost everything that made crows successful. In a world where wild crows were still operating at full cognitive capacity, that domesticated lineage would be outcompeted at every food source, outmaneuvered at every threat, and driven to extinction within a few hundred generations. If crows had been domesticated 10,000 years ago, if some Neolithic farmer had managed to breed a lineage of docile, compliant, cognitively diminished crows, those birds would not have survived. Their wild cousins would still be on every rooftop, watching the same human faces, solving the same puzzles, remembering the same grudges. The domesticated line would be gone. A failed experiment, erased by the very intelligence it tried to breed out. There is a question embedded in all of this that goes beyond ornithology, beyond domestication biology, beyond the study of corvid cognition. Humans tend to frame domestication as a triumph. We chose the animals. We reshaped them. We bent their genetics to serve our purposes, and in doing so built the agricultural foundation of every civilization on Earth. For sheep and cattle and chickens and dogs, that framing is accurate. Those animals were reshaped by human selection into forms that exist primarily to serve human needs. They are successes, measured by the logic of the species that created them. But crows looked at the same arrangement and declined. Not by fleeing into remote forests where humans could never follow. Not by becoming aggressive or poisonous or elusive. They declined by staying. By living in our cities, feeding from our waste, nesting on our buildings, and maintaining every neuron, every social behavior, every learned tradition, every grudge, and every funeral that makes them who they are. They extracted the benefits of human civilization without surrendering any of their cognitive independence. And they accomplished this not through submission, not through avoidance, but through intelligence. The exact trait that domestication would have required them to sacrifice. Every morning in every city on Earth, crows wake on ledges and power lines and rooftop edges overlooking streets they have memorized in detail no map application can match. They know which humans carry food. They know which ones threw a rock last spring. They know which garbage trucks arrive on which mornings and which restaurant dumpsters are left unlocked on Tuesday nights. They have mapped your neighborhood with a precision that would impress a logistics company, and they have accomplished it without surrendering a single gram of brain tissue, without breeding a single generation for obedience, without giving up any fraction of the cognitive inheritance that makes their world legible to them. They live beside you, they watch you leave your home in the morning light, they eat from the margins of your abundance. And occasionally, when the relationship strikes them as worth maintaining, they carry a small, strange, seemingly worthless object across the neighborhood and leave it on the edge of a bird feeder for you to find. But they do not belong to you. They never have. And the reason they never will is the same reason they are the most remarkable birds on this planet. Because intelligence, once it passes a certain threshold, becomes incompatible with submission. The cognitive cost of domestication is a price that only less intelligent species can afford to pay. Crows cannot afford it. Not because they are stubborn or wild or defiant in any romantic sense. Because paying that price would destroy the only thing that has kept them alive for millions of years. The real question is not why humans never domesticated crows. The real question is whether crows looked at every domesticated animal on Earth, at the shrunken brains and the floppy ears and the learned helplessness and the absolute dependence on human goodwill, and quietly made the smarter choice. Every bird humans ever domesticated paid the same price: simpler brains, narrower behavior, total dependence on human infrastructure for survival. Crows looked at that price, weighed it against everything they would lose, and found a way to live beside us without ever paying it.